I trust that Devin has put the study on for the internet guys, internet people, so you can download that. It will be helpful tonight because if you've given a look at it, there are some things that I will need to explain. If the print is too small, yeah, Andy's already made a comment about that. I would direct you to talk with Joel to get you better glasses or something like that. No, in order to keep everything on one page, front and back, yeah, I had to reduce the size of the print a bit. But I have a big print up here, and that's because I can't read what I give you. It's too small, so I have a print. Okay, we're going to begin looking at a narrative in the book of Genesis. Pastor Stephen has asked me to continue the series of studies in the book of Genesis. He had asked me to do the study on the narrative of the Tower of Babel. When he originally approached me to do this, that was the next narrative in order. But he got the date wrong, and so he pushed me up to this week, and so I get to do the call of Abram, or Abraham as we know him better. But I was glad, of course, to do that because it's one of my favorite passages. It really is. And so we're going to continue with our study of the narratives in the book of Genesis, following the sequence that Pastor Stephen has laid out, that the book of Genesis is more than just a story. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have narratives that help tell us the flow of the story. But we're not going to start in the book of Genesis. We're going to start in the book of Hebrews, where the writer wrote this. It's there at the top of your page. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Now, in all of the moves that you have made, especially you have been in the service, was there ever a time when you had to move to a different place and you didn't know what base you were going to or what city you were going to? I would say most likely not. The armed service that you were in, most likely it said, you're moving from this place to this place, and they wanted you at a specific place. When we followed our mission call, we were assigned a position in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Well, we didn't have the choice to go anyplace else. That was where the mission board needed us, and we were more than willing to go to that place, even though we did not know anything about that city. It was a challenge in a lot of ways. So let's consider and try to put ourselves in Abram's place. The writer of Hebrews says that when God called him to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, he had no idea where that was. He didn't know where he was going, but he went. And so the writer of Hebrews is telling us that, yeah, Abram had come to a point where his faith was mature enough that he responded positively to God's call, even though not all the details were made clear to him. And so we come to this passage today, which is chapter 12 of Genesis, and I call it a watershed narrative. Now, if you followed Pastor Stephen's studies to this point, you'll know that he dealt with the narratives, the histories that we have in Genesis 1 through 11. And they deal with what is often called the primeval history. Although it is possible to date some of the things that are found in chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis. Not everything is clear. We cannot establish a precise date for everything that we read in those chapters. And so it is often referred to as primeval history. We're a little bit fuzzy on some of the dates. When we come to chapter 12 of Genesis, things begin to clear up just a bit. Why? Because we enter a world in an epoch where there are extra biblical records, and had been for really a millennium, to help us understand what was going on in the world in that period of time. It is a watershed narrative because up to chapter 12 in Genesis, it appears that God was working with humanity in general. Now, he did have what we might call the individuals that he worked with. We, of course, what comes to mind are Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, of course. And then we see that God tried to work with humanity and all their faults. When we get to chapter 12 of Genesis, we can see that God is now working with one family and one man particular. And so that's why it's a watershed narrative. It seems that the strategy, you might say, has changed. God is now using one individual to continue the work that he started. So that's why we're going to look at what happened. Now, on your page, you will see a little chart there. And I'm not going to go through and rehearse everything that we find in Genesis 1 through 11, but it will help us to see the importance of the narrative about the call of Abraham if we put it into the context of Genesis 1 through 11. Now, the organization here is really not my doing. It was gleaned from several sources. And the title that is often given is that in these chapters, Genesis 1 through 11, particularly Genesis chapter 3, that deals about the sin in the garden, up to chapter 11, we can see two rails of history, two side-by-side parallel histories, you might say. One is the propagation of sin. Now, think about it. Where did sin begin, and with how many people did it begin? Well, go back to Genesis chapter 3. It began in the garden, and there were two people involved. All right, when we get down to chapter 11, what does that chapter deal with? We talked about it, or Pastor Stephen talked about it last week. Chapter 11 of Genesis deals with what? This is the uncomfortable pause. Yeah. And what happened? Is it a story about one person, or is it a story about many persons? Or about many people? Yeah. So would you say that from the garden to the Tower of Babel, there was indeed a propagation of sin? Sin grew. It grew to such a point that in chapter 6, God said, I'm sorry I made you guys. I'm going to wipe you off the face of the planet. So we can see that in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, we do see one path, that sin kept getting worse and worse and worse. But we can also see that grace was given in each of these narratives. So let's look, for example, at the 5 narratives that make up Genesis really 3 through 11. The first, of course, is the garden. What was the problem in the garden? You've got it right there, but let's see if you can come up with maybe another word or a phrase that might be better. What was the problem in the garden? Yeah, disobedience. All right, don't do that, and they did it. I mean, I've gotten to the point where I don't use the common word that talks about what happened in the garden, the fall. I don't think that adequately describes what happened. What happened was that they disobeyed and they sinned, they rebelled. That's a better word. The word fall seems to me to take away the personal responsibility that these people had. It's like, well, I just stumbled and fell off the cliff. Well, no, they wantonly disobeyed a direct order. And so that was the sin. They really wanted what was not appropriate for humans to have. And so what was the punishment? Now, I ask my students this, and I'm always surprised at what they say. What was the punishment that was meted out in the garden? Death, yeah. Although, as Pastor Stephen well pointed out, the death only came centuries later. It didn't happen immediately, which was, in a way, a demonstration of God's grace. Well, let me ask the question this way. And I ask my students at DBU this, and they generally get it wrong, so you'll be in good company if you don't get it. Was the couple cursed in the garden? Now, before you answer, think about what the biblical text says. Was the couple cursed because of their disobedience? What was cursed? The earth was cursed. And there was one other creature cursed. The serpent. So what does that mean for the couple? Was the couple cursed? Well, if the text doesn't say they were cursed, then we pretty much need to stick with the text. They were not cursed. Why? Well, because God had a plan, and it did not include that. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't suffer the consequences of their rebellion. Pain in childbirth, domination by another being, a cursed earth, work would be hard. Adam would return to the very dust out of which he was taken. How about that for a prospect for life? Knowing that you work your fingers to the bone, and what do you get? Besides bony fingers, you become a pile of dust again. That's not a very encouraging future. So imagine living in a world like that. And so even though the couple was not cursed, they did suffer the consequences of the rebellion. But how is God's grace demonstrated? Now we're following here, and I'm trying to show, and this all has a connection with the call of Abram. How was God's grace demonstrated to the couple? And there's two ideas here. The first was that God provided adequate clothing. He provided for their basic needs. After their sin, what did they try to do? Besides hiding, they tried to make for themselves coverings out of leaves. And he also did something that may not sound like a grace, but it certainly was. He protected the tree of life. He did not allow the couple to go back into the garden and eat of the tree of life in the state of rebellion that they were in. So why is that grace? Why is that a demonstration of God's care and concern? What would have happened had the couple managed some way or another to avoid the cherubim with the seraphim with the flaming sword? If they had gotten around that and gotten back in the garden and eaten of the tree of life in their sinful state, what would be the implication? wow, live forever in that state. There would be no hope. And so by protecting the tree of life, God basically gave the couple a hope. Very interesting. So do you see what we're trying to build here? There was the sin, which was the rebellion. There was the consequences of the sin, the punishment. But God's grace was demonstrated. Well, what about Cain and Abel? Well, the sin was obvious, homicide. But even before that, what attitude did Cain demonstrate? Several, actually. He got upset with his brother because God had accepted his brother's sacrifice, but didn't accept his, so he was jealous. When God confronted him after his crime, what did he say? Am I my brother's keeper? He was certainly irreverent when it comes to his responsibility. And so you can see that it was a sin. So, what was the punishment? And this is indeed interesting. Cain was cursed. Now, what does all that mean? We really don't have much in the Bible to tell us that. But Adam and Eve were not cursed, but their son Cain was. So how was God's grace then demonstrated to Cain? They put a mark on him. God put a mark on him so that his life would be preserved. And so he would have to live the rest of his life knowing that he was responsible for the death of his brother. And then comes Noah and the flood. How would you describe the condition of the world before the flood? Think back at what Pastor Stephen has taught us and presented to us. What does the text say when God looked down and saw the condition of humanity? What did he see? How did he characterize their hearts? They were corrupt. He looked down and saw every imagination of their hearts is evil. And so he declared the flood to change that. That was the punishment for the sin of being corrupted. It was a society without brakes. They were freewheeling, doing what they wanted. So where was God's grace demonstrated in the flood? Well, that should be a no-brainer. Who found favor with God in the midst of all this? Noah, of course. And after the flood, there was a new beginning. Noah got the same command that humanity received in Genesis chapter 1, to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. It was a new beginning. Well, that new beginning didn't last. Well, it lasted, but there were some mishaps. Then comes this story about Noah and his sons. A very interesting story. After coming out of the ark, Noah built an altar. He worshiped. But he also planted a vineyard. And as he was enjoying too much the fruits of his labor, he got drunk. Ham came in, dishonored his father in some way. Don't know exactly what happened, but the upshot is that he went out and told his brothers, look at Dad, look what's going on there. And so when Noah woke up, who did he curse? And this is theologically significant. Who did he curse? Did he curse Ham, who had dishonored his father? No. He cursed Ham's son, who was Canaan. He cursed Canaan. Now, why would that be theologically significant? What land was God going to give Abram and his descendants? Wasn't it the land of Canaan? Yeah. And so the Canaanites were indeed cursed. And basically, the entrance into the land later, centuries later, by Joshua and those that had come out of Egypt, that was a demonstration of what the curse on Canaan would eventually mean. That God would give their land to the Israelites. Where's the blessing in all this? Well, Canaan was cursed, but Shem and Japheth were blessed. And Shem, of course, was how would you call it? The ancestor of the Semites. You have anti-Semitism or Semitism? Well, it's from Shem. He was the father of all the Israelites. Finally, the Tower of Babel. We've already talked a little bit about that. The sin, of course, was human arrogance, trying to build something to reach somewhere that was inaccessible to you. That is, to humans. It was human arrogance that fueled the building of the Tower of Babel. That was the sin. What was the punishment? Well, the punishment was the confusion of languages. And then the dispersion of all those who had gathered in that particular place because they wanted to stay together. They did not want to fulfill the original mandate for humanity. Go back to Genesis chapter 1. What did God tell the humans, the men and the women who were created? What was their task? To be fruitful, to multiply, and fill the earth. So you get to chapter 11 of Genesis, and what are these people doing? Well, they may have been fruitful, but they weren't filling the earth. They said, no, we don't want to leave where we are. We're happy where we are. We're going to stay here. And on top of that, we're going to build us a monument to our, what? Our arrogance? Our power? We just don't really know. We talked a little, Pastor Stephen, of course, dealt with that passage last week. The Tower of Babel, although we don't exactly know what it was, could very well have been the idea is that it would be built up so that one could reach God. Another idea is it was a stairway so that God would come down to the people. Either way, it was a human endeavor trying to bridge an abyss that they couldn't bridge. They couldn't bring God down to them, nor could they climb sufficiently high to reach God. So it was human arrogance. So God confused their speech. How does this point to Abram? Well, it basically sets the stage for what we see in Genesis chapter 12. So let's focus now on the time that we have left. I spent quite a bit of time talking about the first chapters. Let's look at chapter 12. So Abram and his family were natives of Mesopotamia, southeastern part of Mesopotamia, or of the Chaldees, it's often called, modern-day Iraq. They lived in the city of Ur, which from all accounts was a prosperous commercial city, but one given over to idolatry. Now, what did this mean for Abram and his family? Well, Joshua tells us a little bit about that when he gave instructions to the people before entering the land of Canaan. And it's written there on your page. Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods." And so at that time, Terah, Abram's father, and the family, for all we know, were polytheists. Certainly they were pagans of some sort. They had not come to an understanding of the God that we know of in the Bible. So, what happened? God calls Abram out of that place. Now, there is a bit of a difficulty in knowing whether Abram's call came at Ur or in Haran later on. Be that as it may, Abram heard the call and he obeyed. So God's call directed Abram to do something that would eventually change the history of the world. Now you are perhaps familiar with the call narrative. It's on your page, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Let's read that together. Let me read it for you. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now let's look at this passage, particularly beginning with the first phrase there. Pay attention to what God told Abram to do. He addressed Abram with an imperative, a command, go. And he directed Abram to leave 3 specific things. Let's look at how they kind of work together. First of all, he said, go from your country. He was to leave the culture that he had grown up in. Now think about how easy that would be for you. Sometimes it's hard enough to go from one city to another in the same state. I probably would have a breakdown if, figuratively speaking, if I had to move to Dallas. I don't know that I could make that move. I would want to stop off somewhere in the middle, Jerry World or someplace like that. But God told Abram to leave his country, the culture, the language, the customs that he had grown up with. So the broad thing that God was calling Abram to do was to leave all of that culture. Then he said, go from your kindred, that is, your relatives. Leave the security of your relatives. Now, how easy is that for you? You accept a job in another city, another state, and you leave your family behind. I remember talking with a young mother at Southwestern Seminary, and she and her family had come to study at the seminary, and she was having a hard time with the move. And so we began to talk, and Nell and I were talking with the family. We began to talk a little bit. Of course, you know where Southwestern Seminary is, on the south side of town. And I think at that time we were living in what we call Carroll Park. It was seminary housing. And so I was asking her, this has been difficult for you. She says, where did you come from before you came to seminary? Oh, we came from the north side of Fort Worth. So there was enough trauma in leaving North Fort Worth and going to South Fort Worth that this particular family was having a hard time dealing with that. As far as I know, we were all speaking the same language. We pretty much liked the same food. So it's not always easy to live or to leave what you've grown up, knowing. And then finally he said, go from your father's house. Now that may seem to be kind of isn't that the same thing as kindred? Well, basically it's talking about the security of immediate family. Now, of course, the immediate family back then was a little larger, but leaving your parents, I can recall when, I can't speak for Nell, well, Nell too, when we graduated from college, there was one thing on our mind: getting out of the house. I lived for 4 years going to school, doing my university work. I lived at home, and that has a benefit. My dad worked for Gulf Oil, so gas was free. Not literally, he paid for it, but get this, it was only 25 cents a gallon, so and I drove an MG Midget. It had an 8-gallon, no, it had a 7-gallon gas tank. So I couldn't even fill up my car and get the little gift that they were giving out at the service station, because you had to have a minimum fill up of 8 gallons to get the little gift. I couldn't even get that, so. God told Abram to leave the security of his family. So what does all this mean? Well, in a way, it's God peeling away the layers of security that Abram had come to depend on. So what was God asking then Abram to do? You're going to leave that, and now you're going to depend on me. But I've got something for you. And here is where the 7 promises, or the 7 aspects of God's promise to Abram comes in. And you see them listed there on the page. Each one of these aspects, either 7 promises or 7 aspects of the same promise, be that as it may. Let's look at each one in turn. God told Abraham that he would make of him a great nation. Now, I don't know how Abraham understood that at that time. He didn't have any kids yet. But God told him, there's something for you down the road. I will bless you. Well, that sounded like a good thing. Okay. I will make your name great. Now, think back as to what the people on the plain of Shinar, the Tower of Babel, what did they want to do? Yeah, they wanted to build a tower to make their own name great. God told Abraham, says, that's not what you're supposed to do. I'm going to make your name great. So that is dependence on God. And you will be a blessing. So look how he frames these. I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And you will be a blessing. Now there's a tremendous lie being propagated in a lot of parts of the world that God wants to bless you materially and you deserve it. Well, they don't say that with the blessing should come the giving. They seem to overlook that part. So the theology, if that's what you want to call it, of prosperity is all wrong. If you're blessed, you should be blessed. You may be being blessed so that you can bless. You pay it forward, as they say. And then God said, I will bless those who bless you. He would be removing certain barriers to Abram's life. Him who dishonors you, that is, brings contempt upon you, I will curse. So Abram found himself in God's favor. And then look at the last part of the promise. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, how is this going to happen? Well, many see this last part as a messianic prophecy, that would be how Abram would become a blessing to the entire world, because it was from Abraham's lineage that came people like Joshua and David, and then later the Messiah. Is that what God has in mind? It's hard to read these promises without thinking about how God worked with the people. It is impossible to see in these promises and not see how God worked not only in Abram's life, but in the life of those around him. These promises would later be confirmed when God made a covenant with Abram in chapter 15. Now, there would be some who say that the promises in chapter 12 are a covenant. Well, the word covenant is not used. It's not used until chapter 15. But it includes what God told Abraham. It ratified those promises. So what was Abram's response? It is significant to note that Abram's response to God's call was, so Abram went as the Lord had told him. The implication is that Abram went without questioning what God had wanted him to do. Now, as he traveled the land, he had traveled basically from north to south in the land of Canaan, and he made several stops along the way. And in some of these stops, he built an altar. And at least on one of these stops, the Lord appeared to Abram and gave him another significant promise. It's written there on your page. So then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So you can see how Abram was responding to God's call. God was promising him wonderful, great things. Abraham responds by recognizing who his benefactor is. He builds an altar. Now observe a couple of things here that I think are important. Abram is promised a place to stay, a land, but yet he was still a sojourner. He moved around quite a bit. He was living in a land that was not yet his. The Canaanites were still there. Now, he had been promised that land, but the promise really wasn't fulfilled until centuries later. Abraham is promised to become a large nation, but he and his wife Sarai remained childless. What does that mean? Well, it comes down to the question of trust. Was Abram going to trust God to fulfill his promises? Abram is promised a land, but the land was occupied by the Canaanites. So there was a lot that had to happen for that promise to be realized. Now you understand that these promises were given to Abram some 300 or 400 years before the Israelites who had left Egypt and had gone into the land of Canaan to conquer the land. It was going to be a while, not just a minute. It was going to be minutes before these promises were fulfilled. Put yourself in Abram's place. Would you be willing to wait patiently on God? Well, if you know the story of Abram and then later Abraham, and Pastor Stephen will certainly take us through this, you know that sometimes he got quite impatient. So, at this point, the only choice that Abram had was to trust. It faltered, and we'll see how that happened in a minute, but his budding faith is demonstrated by the fact that he erected on multiple occasions altars as he made his way through the land. And I found this quote that might help us understand. Before Abram builds a nation, he builds altars, which is an interesting observation. Before he becomes a blessing, he becomes a worshiper. You wait till you receive a blessing to give thanks to God. Before God uses him publicly, God shapes him privately. If you follow the trajectory of Abram's life later to Abraham, you'll see that Abraham that we meet in chapter 12 is really not the one that we get to know in chapters 22 and 23. We see a maturity there. How so? Well, Abram was told to take his only son, Isaac, and sacrifice him on an altar. Abraham didn't bat an eye. He obeyed. And of course, God intervened. Well, that brings us now to the last part of chapter 12, which is a very interesting story. I want to read it all. It's not recorded there and all on the page, not the whole chapter. But the narrative that talks about Abram takes a sharp turn. So far, everything looks so good. Looks great. Abraham obeyed God, built altars, received promises, things looked going good. And what happened? Well, let me just read it. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, and for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." So it was when Abram came to Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh saw her and commanded her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep and oxen, male donkeys and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she was my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So what was the problem here? Was it the problem that Abram lied to Pharaoh? Well, most people think that was the case. But if you read the book of Genesis carefully, and you get over to chapter 20, verse 12, you'll discover that Sarah was indeed Abraham's sister, half-sister. So that wasn't the problem. She was indeed his half-sister. So what was the problem? Well, think about the promises. What had God promised to do with Abraham? Well, look at him. What were some of the promises? They're going to bless him. What else? God promised what? What did he promise he was going to make out of Abram? A great name, yeah. Was he going to give Abram copious descendants? Well, it doesn't use those words, but it says, "I'll make you a great nation." And how is this going to happen? What would be the mechanism, the biological means by which this great nation would begin to be formed? What had to happen? But Abram and Sarai would have to have kids. Right. That was how it was going to happen. Well, where's Sarai at this point in the narrative? Where is she? She's in Pharaoh's house. So how is that promise going to be fulfilled if Sarai is over there in Pharaoh's house and Abraham is enjoying the fruits of Pharaoh's blessing, at least for a time? Why did he do that? Well, it's quite clear why Abram told his wife to say what she did. When the Egyptians see you, this is why they will kill you, but they will let me live. He gave her to Pharaoh so he could save his own skin. That's not very noble. Let me tell you, that is not very noble at all. And so, what happens when there's famine in the land of promise? What kind of promised land is that has famines? Well, could it be that God was testing Abram's resolve? Was he testing his trust and faith? Perhaps. So what do we learn from these narratives? Well, let's think, first of all, about the narrative of Abram and Sarai in Egypt. When difficulties arise in life, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. Our faithfulness is still required. Now, if you read the rest of Genesis, you know that Abram did this again. It seemed like he would have learned, but later on, Isaac wanted to do the same thing, but God said, no, don't do like your idiot father did. I didn't say that. Don't do what he did. You stay here. And then God blessed Isaac. And so when difficult times come, where do we go? Do we go down to Egypt and barter our future for temporary promises? No. Faithfulness is still required. Decisions driven by fear and self-preservation seldom turn out well. Don't make decisions based on fear. If you're afraid, seek out advice. Go to someone who can help you work through that. Dependence on God is the key to making it through the difficult times. Now, it's interesting, God's plan was so well in place that he intervened so that his plan could be continued and rescued Sarai from Pharaoh's house, sent her back to Abram's house, and then sent Abram packing, which was really a good thing. He did take away some goods and things, so that was part of God's blessing to him. But trust is always required. So what do we learn about these narratives? Quickly. Let me just read them, because there's a little video that I want to show. I've shown it before, but it's worth seeing again. From these narratives, we learn that God may call us to obedience, even though we may not believe we are ready. Now, I feel certain Abram did not feel like he was ready to follow this perhaps unknown God, or the God that he was coming to know. But the text says that he went. Now, he's made some slips along the way. But did God use him even in spite of his slips? Well, of course he did. Of course he did. Our obedience may require us to give up things upon which we have come to rely. That's always a possibility. Obedience to God does not mean we have to know everything that we would like to know. Well, how am I going to support myself? Well, personal illustrations are not always the best, because they are just that, personal illustrations. Nell and I were living in Yazoo City, Mississippi. I was working at the chemical plant. She was teaching school. We were dinks. Double income, no kids. And we weren't making a lot of money, but in Yazoo City, Mississippi, in that time, we were living high on the hog, so to speak, and there were a lot of hogs in Mississippi too. So we packed up and came to Fort Worth with no visible means of support. Now, we were wise enough, and my dad taught me the meaning of saving, and so we came to Fort Worth with enough saved up to get us through at least 6 months. So we knew we had been here, imagine, 3 or 4 weeks, and Nelda got her a job teaching in Aledo, where she stayed the entire time we were in seminary. When needed, I worked part-time. The last year, I was a janitor at the HEB school district. Yeah, the nighttime janitor, cleaning up elementary school floors and toilets. Yeah, you do what you have to do. Yeah. So sometimes following God's call means you don't know everything that's going to happen. But if you trust, he will take care of you. Worship is an essential part of our journey. It happened in Abraham's case. Fear is the enemy of faith. Trust rather than be afraid. And finally, God's call may have a global aspect. Our obedience can have world-changing consequences. You ever thought about that?